Part 2. Witnesses of Miracles. Despite some critics' dismissal of the value of eyewitness testimony is accepted as a form of evidence in law, journalism, sociology, anthropology, and, to cite my own line of work, historiography. None of these disciplines could exist apart from testimony. So those who a priori dismiss the value of testimony are actually dismissing entire spheres of knowledge and investigation. Indeed, were I to reject all testimony, I could not accept anyone else's claims about what they experienced. For example, I could not reasonably ask my wife, after she has been outside, whether I need a jacket today. No one lives by such a constrictive epistemology. Instead, we critically evaluate testimony. I turn to medical documentation later, but in this part of the book, I explore some eyewitness accounts. Eyewitness accounts also appear in later chapters where they are relevant to particular issues, such as healings from blindness, raisings from the dead, nature miracles, and so forth. Some accounts here and later also include medical documentation, just as medical test reports often require a narrative from the patient, a witness, to give them context. For miracle reports from before modern medicine, as for example in the Gospels, and reports from many parts of the world where medical technology is not yet widely available, such accounts are nearly our only window into what people have experienced. Chapter 4. Are there many witnesses of miracles? Minister Ken Fish shared with me that he prayed for a woman dying from acute liver failure in the ICU. Her heart monitor was beeping very slowly. She was gray and looked as if she were already dead. He says that when he put his hand on her, he suddenly felt a surge of power. The heart monitor came alive as she began shaking, and it beeped wildly for some 90 seconds. She was healed and discharged that night and remains well today. Fish recounts that this fits a pattern of many healings when he prays. Dramatic healings such as those of Barbara Comiskey, now Snyder, which I recounted in the book's preface, are not an everyday occurrence in most of our individual lives. Nevertheless, when we take into account the span of the entire globe, they are occurring regularly. The stats: hundreds of millions of witnesses. A 2006 Pew Forum survey of just 10 countries on 4 continents suggests that about 200 million Pentecostal and Protestant charismatics in those countries alone claim to have witnessed divine healing. Perhaps more surprisingly, some 39% of Christians in those countries who are not Pentecostals or Protestant charismatics also claim to have witnessed divine healing. Hundreds of millions of people around the world claim to have witnessed such experiences. Such figures are at best merely estimates. Nevertheless, it seems clear that we are talking about a lot of people. No one would claim that all these reports involve genuine miracles, but neither is it reasonable for anyone to simply ignore all of them while claiming there are no credible witnesses for miracles. Indeed, it is surely intellectually dishonest to dismiss them all from the start on the basis of uniform human experience, or to simply go cherry-picking among the least plausible examples to justify neglecting more plausible ones. These experiences seem more common in some places and times than others. One Western researcher, for example, was astonished to discover that 83% of the people he interviewed at a church in the Philippines had experienced significant healings. Nevertheless, even societies less prone to express such experiences may include members who have experienced them. Another survey shows that more than a third of Americans claim to have witnessed or experienced what they believe to be divine healing. Still another survey reports that more than a quarter of Americans, 27%, experienced a physical healing that could only be explained as a miraculous healing and not solely as a result of normal process, medical procedure, or the body healing itself. While many may be too intimidated to discuss these experiences publicly, Some 38%, close to 100 million Americans, expressed belief that they had experienced some sort of divine miracle. Doctors as witnesses. Indeed, another survey suggests that nearly 3/4 of doctors in the United States believe in miracles. More important, over half of the physicians surveyed noted that they had witnessed what they considered to be miracles. 3 factors make this figure appear even more compelling. First, the context of the survey question mentions biblical miracles, which most people think of as fairly dramatic events. Second, doctors' scientific training appropriately leads them to look for ordinary causes first, so many may not have counted as miraculous cases in which God could possibly have used ordinary causes in nature to achieve a miraculous outcome. Remember our paradigmatic case of the east wind parting the sea. Third, any responders inflexibly opposed to belief in miracles would not have interpreted an event as a miracle, no matter how extraordinary it was. Other studies show us that most of those who pray for and believe they have experienced miracles do not even inform their physician that they prayed. Physicians are thus not always even aware of a spiritual context for many of the recoveries they witness. Researching eyewitnesses' claims. Some people complain that there are plenty of stories about miracles, but they're like rumors. The information is always second or third hand. That's why I like to trace stories back to witnesses. I recount hundreds of such cases in Miracles, the credibility of the New Testament accounts. In addition to collecting more generic stats, I wanted to know the sorts of experiences people have in mind when they say they have experienced divine healing. Some of the stories shared with me were less dramatic, such as warts vanishing overnight, or someone recovering from an illness that often goes away on its own. I could even recount a number of experiences of my own, for example, in which severe sickness disappeared during a simple prayer. See chapter 34. But many of those who shared their experiences recounted more dramatic incidents. As noted earlier, different disciplines require different approaches. Although we always need to evaluate witnesses' reliability, eyewitness testimony is accepted as a form of evidence in law, journalism, sociology, anthropology, and, in my line of work, historiography. When eyewitnesses are otherwise credible people with something to lose, we normally value their testimony over the skepticism of non-witnesses. For example, imagine that, as an officer is interviewing witnesses to an accident, a passerby interrupts, "That's not what happened." The officer may invite the passerby to give an account of what he witnessed. What would you think of this passerby's approach if he responded, "I didn't witness anything happen. I wasn't there. That's why I know it didn't happen"? We probably wouldn't be inclined to take his opinion very seriously. Nor would we take it more seriously if even 100 non-witnesses offered the argument that, because they were not present, an event did not happen. Why should it be any different in the case of miracles? One does not even have to start with the premise that God exists to accept evidence for miracles. One simply has to be open-minded about the possibility. And if evidence supports the authenticity of some miracles, then there is reason to be open to the possibility of other ones. Those who dismiss all claims for miracles have often never even looked at evidence for any of them. Some will object, miracles are different from accidents, because we have witnesses all over the world to accidents, but we don't have any for miracles. Yet this objection simply assumes what it claims to prove. As we have noted, hundreds of millions of people report miracles, many of them very significant. David Hume's argument against miracles rests on the lack of credible eyewitnesses. Yet I believe that if Hume had had access to the range of testimony we have today, he would not have ventured this argument. At the least, he would have had to adjust it, because his argument in its original form simply does not work today. Discounting witnesses. Some people today counter, "You can't trust all eyewitness claims. Think how many people claim to have seen space aliens." The analogy is not very even-handed, however. In the United States, the best estimates of the number of people who claim to have witnessed space aliens run to many thousands. But in the same country, some 34% of the population, more than 100 million people, claim to have witnessed divine healing, according to a 2008 Pew Forum survey. That is, witnesses of divine healing easily outnumber witnesses of space aliens more than 1,000 to 1. Much of the evidence cited for alien abductions comes from memories recovered through hypnosis, which is also noted for planting false memories. The majority of people who believe in divine healing do not believe in space aliens, and simply lumping them together because one disagrees with both is an ethically questionable substitute for an argument. One might explain some miracle accounts as the misinterpretation of coincidence, others as the result of misdiagnosis, and yet others as the curing of psychosomatic illnesses. Initial misdiagnosis is not uncommon, and correct diagnoses are not always correctly interpreted. Some apparent healings are adrenaline-driven excitement without long-term benefit. Some suggest that as many as half of ailments treated on a regular basis by doctors lack detected organic causes. Even if this figure is high, mental and emotional components to health are certainly significant. God can work psychologically as well as physically, but skeptics are naturally less impressed by non-physical claims. Further, God designed our bodies to be able to recover naturally in many circumstances. God often works through natural means, as we have seen. Remember again the parting of the sea in Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. Moreover, some healing claims are simply attempts to deny reality. Some are even fraudulent attempts to gain publicity or financial support for ailing ministries. Nevertheless, these explanations do not easily account for all kinds of claims. Sometimes we have multiple independent witnesses. Sometimes we have clear medical evidence that precludes misdiagnosis. In some of these instances, a skeptical response is, the mere fact that we cannot explain it and that it seemed coordinated with prayer does not mean that God did it. Maybe there's some natural explanation that we simply don't know. It is true enough that there are many things that we do not know. But if one is prepared to dismiss any possible evidence for miracles in this way, it seems disingenuous to demand evidence to begin with. Open-mindedness ought to invite openness to evidence. Moreover, we can observe a pattern of miracles in some times and places that suggests that God sometimes works in special ways. For example, nearly all of those in my or my wife's immediate circle who reported non-medical resuscitations in the context of prayer were people of prayer working to honor Jesus. When miracle accounts cannot be explained by natural means, some, like Hume, are ready to dismiss all witnesses as psychotics or liars. In the past, for example, skeptical researchers often crudely dismissed women's miracle claims as the result of feminine hysteria. But those who choose to explain away all miracle accounts in these terms should be clear about what they are doing. They are so committed to believing that miracles cannot occur that they are willing to dismiss as liars millions of people, not because these people have already been shown to be untrustworthy, but simply because their reported experience conflicts with the skeptic's prior assumptions. Again, those who explain away all miracle claims without considering them should not pretend to be neutral. As we will hear in chapter 5, millions of non-Christians have been convinced and converted as a result of their extraordinary experiences. Sometimes the experience of miracles has changed even Western scholars' views. Walter Wink, a founding member of the generally skeptical Jesus Seminar, notes that at one time he disbelieved in miracles. Then, he says, he encountered some, such as a large uterine tumor disappearing apparently immediately after prayer. He points out that those who disbelieve others' testimonies because of their own lack of experience are at a disadvantage in understanding the world. Hume and his critics used an imaginary case to argue back and forth about whether it is rational to consider testimony for miracles. In this imaginary story, Dutch visitors told the South Asian ruler that in their own country, people could ride horses on rivers frozen as hard as stone. The ruler concluded that these visitors must be liars, since their report contradicted reality. Hume argued that the ruler was correct to disbelieve them, given his local reality. Hume's critics argued that the ruler was wrong because he limited reality to his own experience and so denied the eyewitness experience of others. We cannot always extrapolate from the settings with which we are most familiar to all settings universally. Are all witnesses uneducated? Hume dismissed some healing reports by stereotyping the reporters as ignorant and uneducated. Aside from the fact that it does not take any specialized education to notice that one is no longer blind or deaf, or that water now looks, smells, and tastes like wine, the prejudice is unfair. While education can make us less gullible, some kinds of education can also make us more skeptical than we need to be about particular topics. Moreover, there are, in fact, plenty of educated eyewitnesses of miracles. This is why I have sometimes mentioned witnesses' doctoral degrees in the book. Degrees do not by themselves make witnesses more reliable, but they do challenge the prejudice that educated persons do not witness events they experience as divine. Here, I focus on one circle in which a number of highly educated people attest witnessing miracles: Iris Ministries in Mozambique, founded by Roland and Heidi Baker. Accounts in this book represent various denominations and theological perspectives, not all of which appreciate each other. Roland and I have had numerous discussions of theology, however, and for what it's worth, our theological perspectives seem pretty close. One of Roland's theological mentors was the respected New Testament scholar Gordon Fee, who has also been a mentor to me. I have met some people who have criticized these friends by highlighting clips of off-the-cuff, out-of-context, or now out-of-date statements on the Internet. But I know them well enough to affirm this couple's integrity and intelligence. Heidi, who speaks 7 languages, holds a Ph.D. in theology from King's College London. Roland holds a Doctor of Ministry degree from United Theological Seminary in Ohio. Their ministries support some 10,000 orphans in Mozambique. As for integrity, they have suffered extensively and laid their lives on the line for the people they serve. Yet they also offer eyewitness reports of instant healings of deafness and blindness and of raisings from the dead. Most often, these experiences occur in non-Christian villages where no one expects them. The healings generally culminate in many of the people in these villages, people who knew firsthand the previously deaf or blind people, following Christ. Highly educated outsiders have also witnessed these miracles. My friends Wendy J. Dykeman and Andrew Sung Park are both Methodist professors at United Theological Seminary. Andrew did his Ph.D. at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and Wendy did her Ph.D. at Drew University, where they visited Mozambique along with a number of their students. Wendy reports that she witnessed various healings, including that of a blind man. Afterward, she further witnessed the entire village, previously violently hostile to Christianity, choosing to follow Christ. Brandon Walker, who did his Ph.D. at the University of Nottingham, spent several years with Iris Ministries in Mozambique. Although he did not witness dramatic healings daily, he shared with me some of what he did see. This included non-believers healed of blindness and thereupon converted, a girl who was healed of both deafness and inability to speak, and a couple of cases of men unable to walk being instantly healed and walking away. At one conference, a disabled man was carried in by friends. The man explained that he had not been able to work since he became disabled, and that his family therefore beat him and mocked him. It was difficult for him to forgive his family, but Brandon prayed for him that God would help him let go of the anger. For 10 minutes the man lay shaking while Brandon and his friends prayed. Afterward, others helped him up, and then he walked away on his own. Don Cantel, who wrote a doctoral dissertation that focused on Iris Ministries, told me about witnessing miracles and recounts some of these incidents elsewhere in print. I've watched the indescribable excitement in young village children when one of their friends who had been totally deaf from birth could suddenly hear and repeat sounds and words. I've held a boy's badly broken forearm and watched the arm straighten and be completely healed as I prayed. He also reports that food was unexpectedly but clearly supernaturally multiplied on some occasions. Chapter 5. Do only Christians report Christian healings? Someone might protest that Christians have a bias that leads them to report experiences as miracles. While that is probably true in some cases, that explanation does not stretch far enough to address all claims. It also fails to take into account the cases where those with a bias against miracles dismiss them by reaching for any other remotely possible explanation, no matter how much simpler the miracle explanation is. In fact, reports of Christian healing are not even limited to Christians. Millions of non-Christians around the world have changed centuries of many of their ancestral beliefs, often despite considerable social pressure, and become committed followers of Jesus as a result of extraordinary healings. If all these healings were simply ordinary, run-of-the-mill recoveries of the sort that they witnessed in their pre-Christian experience, religious or otherwise, why would they risk social ostracism and leave familiar traditions for a faith completely new to them? God may act anywhere, and some of the experiences reported in this book, like that of Barbara Comiskey-Snyder, narrated in the preface, happen in mainstream U.S. settings. Nevertheless, we learn about these experiences most often on the cutting edge of evangelism, where Jesus' message is breaking fresh ground. That is the way it was in the biblical Gospels and Book of Acts, too. Biola University's J.P. Moreland points out that up to 70% of the rapid evangelical growth in the past few decades has been due to signs, the sorts of divine acts that get people's attention for the message about Christ. A friend's eyewitness account. Suriname is a multicultural nation in South America whose national language is Dutch. Although many people in Suriname have long been Christians, one population group in Nickerie, Suriname, had another dominant faith and had resisted the Christian message for centuries. For generations, only a few hundred Christians lived there, and churches competed with each other for the same members. When I met with Dr. Douglas Norwood in 2006, he shared with me his eyewitness experience from 12 years before, also recounted in his dissertation. He was a Moravian pastor, and Moravians had been among the pioneers of churches there. In November 1994, after he preached, the churches there repented of their divisions and cried out to God for an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Believers went out and began to share their faith with surprised neighbors who had never known the Christians to act this way before. That night, many non-Christians gathered at the church, a few of them hostile. One hostile visitor, perhaps in his 70s, had been paralyzed on his right side virtually all his life. Because he could not walk, his friends had brought him on a blanket or rug and plopped him down on the ground in front of Norwood. This man was not happy. "Your religion is garbage," he shouted. "My religion is garbage too. I've prayed to Shiva and to Vishnu and to my other gods, and nothing happens. Now you want me to pray to Jesus?" As he uttered the name Jesus, his paralyzed arm suddenly shot up into the air. He stared at his own arm, shocked. No one had prayed for him, but when he mentioned Jesus, God healed his paralysis. Norwood reports, "At that instant, he jumped up, grabbed my mic, and began screaming, 'Look what Jesus did for me!' as he danced around, waving his now healed arm in the air." The other visitors were converted almost as quickly as he was. This was the beginning of a movement that, over the next 4 years, brought tens of thousands of people to faith in Christ, most of whom had previously had little exposure to him. The massive growth of the Christian movement in Nickerie in recent decades is well known. Conversions through healings in Asia. China was not included in the Pew Forum survey that I noted earlier. Statistics are notoriously difficult to obtain there, and the figures I provide in this section are simply some observers' estimates. Nevertheless, behind these figures are undoubtedly a significant number of people convinced by healing experiences. For example, one source from within the state-authorized church suggests that half of all Christian conversions over a period of 2 decades in the late 20th century were due to faith-healing experiences. One rural house church estimate puts this figure closer to 90%. Whatever the exact percentage, we may be talking about millions of people converting because of healings. Likewise, Dr. Bal Krishna Sharma, principal of Nepal Theological College, shared with me that 80% of Christian conversions in Nepal are due to healings or deliverance from spirits. Keep in mind that in 1950, outside observers knew of no Christians in Nepal. Now there are more than 500,000. In a country of fewer than 30 million people, we are therefore speaking about a lot of conversions. Sharma himself has some good reason to believe in miracles, since his wife was healed in 1997 of inoperable tuberculosis of the brain, with no lasting effects. The Hindu doctor remarked, "Your Jesus has healed you." The mass conversion of the Nishi tribal people in northeast India is well documented. One dissertation explains how the movement began. A government official's son died. Neither medicine nor sacrifices had helped the boy, but a pharmacist had suggested prayer to Jesus, the Christian God who had once raised Lazarus. The official laid his hand on his boy's head and promised to worship this Christian God if God would heal his son. The child's eyes opened and he recovered, sparking hundreds of conversions in the region. Moreover, because of other beliefs or social pressure, some non-Christians remain non-Christians even after being healed, further weakening charges of Christian bias in reporting. According to one 1981 survey, 10% of non-Christians surveyed in Chennai, India, reported that they had been healed when someone prayed for them in Jesus' name. When I taught at a Baptist seminary, Pastor Israel, a Baptist doctor of ministry student I knew well, told me about his healing experiences in India. The conversation came about because he prayed for my splitting headache, and nothing happened. Of course, it did go away eventually. "It's because I don't have any faith," I complained. "No, it doesn't work here," he observed sadly. "Everybody I pray for in India gets healed." Pastor Israel explained that healing was so common there because God was reaching out in a special way to these precious and desperate people who had never before known about Christ's love for them. Pastor Israel told me that his church grew from maybe 6 people to 600, nearly all from non-Christian backgrounds, as God answered prayer to heal the sick in his community who came for prayer. Because of ancestral and cultural ties, however, many others who were healed did not become Christians, though they remained appreciative of Jesus. Sai Onkem, a Doctor of Ministry student at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, shared with me the story of how his family in India came to follow Jesus. When Sai was 7 or 8 years old, his father, who had regularly ridiculed Christians, was injured in an accident. His mother visited the temples of many deities, promising offerings if they would save her husband. After the father had spent a month in a coma, the doctors declared that he did not have much longer to live. A relative who had become a Christian suggested that the mother try Jesus, who would definitely save your husband. Cy's mother knew Jesus only as the God of people of lower caste, but she now had nothing to lose. Without knowing how to pray to this God, she cried, "O Jesus, you are not our God, yet I come to you pleading for the life of my husband. If you would save his life, we will serve you all of our lives." Cy's father in the ICU then experienced Jesus touching him and speaking to him, and by morning he was completely restored. Despite great social opposition, the family became followers of Jesus. Cy himself later experienced an audible voice calling him to ministry. Rita Jeet prayed to Hindu deities and was a popular radio personality in Fiji. At a point of deep brokenness in her life, she prayed for Jesus to show himself to her if he was real, whereupon she saw a bright man coming from the sky. She became a follower of Jesus, and she began experiencing various miracles. One that she shared involved the twofold healing of a relative. He had abused her when she was younger, but he later became paralyzed from the waist down. Jeet, now a Christian and finding grace to forgive him, felt divine compassion and prayed for him. He was immediately healed, and that family also became followers of Jesus. Other miracles have followed. Nor is the pattern limited to Asia. In Ethiopia, for example, 83% of believers surveyed in a Lutheran, Makane Jesus church several decades ago attributed their conversions to healings or exorcisms. In the U.S., too, healings may lead to conversions. But are such healings merely a recent fashion, or have they happened at other times in history? Chapter 6. Is healing just a new thing? In the introduction to her Oxford University Press book, Healing in the History of Christianity, Amanda Porterfield admits that she did not expect the extent to which I would come to see Christianity as a religion of healing. In this chapter, I trace only a very small sample of historic healing claims. Reports of miracles are not a new discovery or a postmodern fad. They appear in the Old Testament especially, though not exclusively, in the times of Moses, Joshua, Elijah, and Elisha. They fill the pages of the New Testament. Roughly 1/5 of the book of Acts and nearly 1/3 of the Gospel of Mark address miracles. Although Paul's letters to established churches focus more on those churches' current issues, Paul mentions that miracles accompanied his ministry whenever he established new churches. Romans chapter 15, verse 19. He also appeals to his audience's direct experience with his miracles, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 12, and their awareness that such gifts continue among them, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 through 10, Galatians chapter 3, verse 5. James expects healing to continue in answer to the believing prayers of church leaders, James chapter 5, verses 14 through 15. But healing and miracles did not stop at the close of the 1st century. Even 2nd and 3rd century critics of Christianity, both Jewish and pagan, acknowledged that healing occurred through this movement that they disliked. Although later rabbis disagreed with Jesus' movement theologically and often attributed the works of Jesus and his followers to evil magic, they recognized that unusual things happened when Christians prayed. In the early 3rd century, the Egyptian church leader Origen testified that he had witnessed healings and exorcisms. The 3rd century North African bishop Cyprian noted that Christians were sometimes healed during baptism. In the 300s, the African bishop Athanasius, known as his era's leading defender of the Trinity, praised the miraculous feats of the desert monk Anthony. Athanasius invited skeptics to come witness the efficacy of exorcism for themselves. Ordinary letters from this period also report healings. Although many medieval reports of miracles stem from subsequent hagiography, some are contemporaneous accounts dependent on witnesses, including some reports of resuscitations from conspicuous death. Augustine. The famous theologian and North African bishop Augustine, 354 to 430, once believed that miracles had mostly died out. Then he and people close to him experienced some miracles, and he changed his mind. One of the key experiences involved Augustine's good friend Innocent. Innocent had severe anal fistulas, and an operation had not resolved all of them. No anesthesia was available back then, and people sometimes bled to death during surgery. Yet Innocent's doctors all agreed that another operation was necessary. Augustine and other friends prayed with Innocent the night before his second surgery. But Augustine found himself distracted from prayer by Innocent's plaintive wailing. "If you cannot be moved by a prayer like Innocent's," Augustine asked God, "what can possibly move you?" The next morning, Augustine accompanied Innocent to the surgery. The doctors removed the recent bandage and found that Innocent was completely healed. Once Augustine recognized the continuing reality of miracles, he became very serious about documenting them. Over a period of just 2 years, Augustine's diocese collected documentation from first-hand witnesses for some 70 significant healings, including healings of blindness and of long-term inability to walk, as well as raisings from the dead. He testifies that other centers of healings, which had been collecting reports longer, had even larger dossiers. Converted through healings. I mentioned earlier that in recent decades, many people around the world have become Christians after witnessing healings. Conversion in response to healing has much ancient precedent. Many early church fathers reported that many polytheists were converting to Christianity because they witnessed healings. In the late 2nd century, for example, Irenaeus, a bishop in what is now France, described the same sorts of miracles occurring in his day as appear in the Gospels and Acts, leading to many conversions. One North African theologian, Tertullian, even offered to name prominent pagans who were grateful to Christians for bringing them deliverance from evil spiritual powers. Ramsay MacMullen, a leading Yale historian, has recently concluded that the leading cause of conversion to Christianity in the 300s was healing and deliverance. Miracles are associated with the earliest missionaries who evangelized England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, Persia, and elsewhere. In some more recent periods as well, healing has been associated with Jesus' message coming to new peoples. For example, during the predominantly Presbyterian revival in Korea in the early 20th century. By 1981, a thesis that surveyed more than 350 other theses reported more accounts of miracles in new mission contexts than the author had room to use. Healing remains a major feature in majority world evangelism. Protestants versus Catholics. Although healing has continued in various ways throughout history, including several examples noted later in this book, leading Protestant reformers initially reacted against medieval Catholic miracles because of Catholic polemic and popular gullibility about relics of the saints. A relic was something that had belonged to a particularly holy person, now deceased, and it was supposed to retain some of that person's spiritual power. On the basis of several biblical incidents and some subsequent experiences, relics associated with holy people became a focal point for healing in the early centuries of the Church. Despite opposition to relics, the Reformers were not against prayer for recovery. Luther, for example, prayed for Melanchthon's recovery and accepted the possibility of miracles in missionary situations and extraordinary times. Toward the end of his life, Luther also taught about praying for the sick. But Luther hated the abuse of relics, fakes of which were circulating for profit everywhere by this time. Charlatans' exploitation of people's illnesses in the name of healing is not a new practice. Various sites laid claim to one of Jesus' baby teeth, his newborn umbilical cord, and, last but not least, claimed by 8 sites the holy foreskin remaining from his circumcision. Luther complained sarcastically that 18 of the original 12 apostles were buried in Germany. But God does not always play by our rules, even when we have good reason for them. Blaise Pascal was one of history's most brilliant mathematicians, as well as the inventor of an adding machine that was a forerunner of computers. Pascal was also a committed Christian who had a powerful experience with the Holy Spirit. He had sympathies with the Jansenists, members of an Augustinian sect within the Catholic Church. His niece, Marguerite Perrier, had a severe, long-term fistula in her eye, which produced a foul odor. At a Jansenist monastery, however, she was touched with an alleged thorn from Jesus' crown of thorns on March 24, 1656. Was this thorn really from Jesus' crown? Most of us today would consider that suggestion highly unlikely. Nevertheless, the relic provided a contact point for Perrier's faith, and she was instantly and publicly cured. The cure generated so much attention that the Queen Mother of France sent her own physician to investigate, and he verified the cure. Before the influence of the radical Enlightenment, many Protestants, including Scots Reformers, Friends, and Baptists, did continue to affirm and experience miraculous healings. Subsequent Protestants, however, often developed further the Reformers' overreaction against miracles among Catholics, an overreaction that served and was further amplified by the anti-miracle polemic of deists and David Hume. Yet God continued to sometimes tweak these theologian scripts. When healings like those in the Bible occurred, Protestants who did not believe in miracles sometimes called them special providences. This helped them avoid the language of miracles, since they were careful not to use language that made them sound like Catholics. But special providences were essentially what many theologians today call special divine action. The line between such providences and miracles was sometimes quite thin. For example, Mary Maillard's left leg had been weak from birth, but in 1693, as she heard the account of the healing of a disabled man in Mark chapter 2 verses 1 through 12 being read, she thought she heard a voice saying, "Thou art healed," whereupon she found herself cured. Because she was a French Huguenot refugee in England rather than a Catholic, British Protestants accepted the healing, and Cotton Mather, recounting Huguenot miracles in 1696, even speculated that miracles, once restrained because of Roman Catholic apostasy, might now be being renewed in a new age of miracles. In another notable case, Mercy Wheeler had been bedridden since 1726. That year she also lost much of her vision, and she drooled, unable to eat solid food, though she reported that by 1733 God had blessed her with the ability to speak again. Finally, on May 25, 1743, as others prayed with her, she trembled, shook, and spoke something like gibberish as she felt God's presence. The shaking began with her hands, but finally racked her whole body, until when it passed, she felt the first strength she had experienced in many years. Feeling then a compulsion to act, she got up and walked 16 feet, crying out, "Bless the Lord Jesus, who has healed me," to the amazement of all present. The preacher attempted to calm her, but she walked around the room a few more times, and over the next 5 months she kept walking farther and farther. Some theologians were not sure what to make of this event. Following James chapter 5 verses 14 through 15, contemporary Protestants regularly prayed for people's healing, but they expected recovery through providential means, not an instant miracle. This is by no means the most dramatic account of healing we have encountered, but it was certainly enough to disturb some 18th century conservative Protestants. Christian healing is widely Christian. These accounts are not limited to any particular denomination, movement, or for that matter, social or political perspective. For example, the most prominent healing ministry in Germany in the 19th century was that of Lutheran pastor Johann Christoph Blumhardt, mentioned in Chapter 3. Other leading figures were Swiss Protestants Dorothea Trudel and Otto Stockmeyer. Early 19th century Methodist circuit riders in the United States reported healings and other supernatural experiences. Leading North American advocates of divine healing in the late 19th century included Baptist A.J. Gordon, for whom Gordon College and Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary are named, and Presbyterian A.B. Simpson, founder of the Christian and Missionary Alliance. Reformed minister Andrew Murray was a leading advocate in South Africa. Both Simpson and Murray reported experiencing major healings themselves. Some of the most spectacular and consistent reports of healings come from Anglican bishops around the world in the 1920s. These bishops offered eyewitness attestation of dramatic healings, including deafness, blindness, shriveled legs, and so forth, through the ministry of Anglican layman James Moore Hickson. Also in the early 20th century, many dramatic miracles were happening in China through the ministry of John Sung, who remained independent of Western denominations. Partly because of early Protestant criticism, Catholics have often been particularly careful about seeking documentation for miracles. Alfred Bessette, who became Brother André, was from near Montreal and had a gift of healing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. An associate for 15 years remarked that he witnessed miracles virtually every week. Often a paralytic would be cured, or one blind, or someone who had to be brought here on a stretcher. The medical bureau established there considered many cases exaggerated or psychosomatic, but for others the officials lacked naturalistic explanations. A number of mid-20th century healings associated with the ministry of Italian Capuchin friar Padre Pio include medical attestation. Padre Pio himself sometimes noted, as have many others associated with healing, "I didn't do the miracle. I only prayed for you. The Lord healed you." My students over the years, because of the seminaries where I have taught, have been most frequently Baptists, Methodists, and Pentecostals, and they have shared with me numerous experiences. A conservative Presbyterian scholar friend recounted to me 2 extraordinary healings he has witnessed in answer to prayer, including the sudden total disappearance of a cluster of tumors immediately after prayer. The activity of God's Spirit is not limited to a single denomination or circle, though on average miracles probably occur more often among groups that pray for them more often. God acts in history not because all his people have identical, precise theology. God acts, as in Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, to show compassion on many of the needy and to provide foretastes of Christ's kingdom. Chapter 7. Baby Pics. Chapter 6 surveyed healing in some younger eras of the Church. Here I sample briefly some accounts about younger individual lives. Just about everyone likes baby pictures. Pictures of the babies in the following stories would be worth 1,000 words, but reproducing photographs would raise the cost of the book. I will, however, provide some verbal pictures of the events surrounding their births. Even those who doubt divine activity can celebrate with the parents in the following stories. While one might view some of the cases simply as rare anomalies, in contrast to some accounts in later chapters, some of the following stories appear more difficult to explain purely naturalistically. At the very least, no one should be tempted to dismiss the cures of newborns as psychosomatic. It's because they're Christians. In Malia Wiederhold's 3rd trimester, a routine prenatal ultrasound revealed a tumor on her baby's heart. After a second ultrasound confirmed the presence of a tumor in the heart, the doctor warned that the child would probably be mentally challenged and experience multiple seizures throughout the day and would not be able to do much in his life. Malia's husband, Jeff, assured her that everything would be all right. The doctor responded, "I don't think you understand. Everything will not be all right. You need to be prepared for this." Jeff, who was also a health professional, remained insistent, and so did the doctor. As the couple got back in their car, Jeff took Malia's hand and reminded her of something that the Lord had shown her earlier, restoring her own confidence. Jeff encouraged Malia, but given other recent tragedies, she still felt emotionally shaken by the diagnosis. Malia's close friend Valerie, who had been one of her bridesmaids, recalls Malia calling her in tears after the appointment, informing her about the tumor. Valerie agreed to pray and soon shared that she felt that God was holding the baby. Denial is a frequent response to grief, and in the ensuing weeks the medical professionals assumed that the couple's insistence that God would heal their child was just that. Nevertheless, Malia and Jeff felt a confidence that in this case God was going to act. Malia even felt the specific date on which her child, whom they named Jeremiah, would be born, the 28th. Although Malia went into labor on the 26th, Jeremiah was indeed born on the 28th. During the difficult childbirth, Malia felt God saying that he was removing the tumor, but she was kept in suspense even once she delivered. Expecting serious medical difficulties, the medical team rapidly whisked the baby away for more detailed evaluations. For several tense minutes, Malia and Jeff waited for a report, yet the sense of God's peace continued. Finally, the pediatric cardiologist returned and announced, dumbfounded, "The tumor is gone." The midwife, who had seen 2 ultrasounds a couple of weeks apart, protested. "What? I saw it with my own eyes." "Well, where did it go then?" the cardiologist demanded. The midwife shook her head. "It's because they're Christians," she blurted out. Of course, this is not the experience of all Christians, but the midwife knew of this couple's insistence that God had spoken to them. God's activity didn't stop at Jeremiah's birth. Malia's friend Valerie recounts an experience she witnessed when she was babysitting Jeremiah when he was 18 months old. When he heard an elevation worship song, he stopped what he was doing. He was on his knees with his head looking up to heaven and his arms lifted to the sky. He was worshiping God. The medical documents provided to me in this case are clear. I also have the review of internal medicine doctor David McCants, who, having heard Malia's story, went over her medical records independently. He was able to verify the disappearance of the cardiac tumor, as described in her story. Malia's son was diagnosed with a cardiac rhabdomyoma. Cardiac rhabdomyomas are benign tumors that can be identified prenatally on ultrasound or early in the newborn period or infancy. They can sometimes cause severe cardiac arrhythmias or obstruction of cardiac function by blocking normal flow. They can rarely even cause fatal complications. Cardiac rhabdomyomas are often, but not always, associated with a separate medical condition called tuberous sclerosis, in which seizures and cognitive problems are common occurrences. This is one reason the physician who saw Malia prior to her delivery warned, "Everything will not be all right." The described time frame for spontaneous regression of rhabdomyomas, if it occurs, is over months to years. This is why its disappearance over the span of 2 weeks was completely unexpected by her physicians, and I could find no similar cases described in the medical literature in my review on the subject. Malia's story is compelling, and I believe, like her, that it is a story of God's intervention on behalf of her son. Sierra, come forth. Manuel and Maria Hernandez were looking forward to the birth of their next child. Since Maria's diagnosis of diabetes in 2002, the prospect of more children had seemed unlikely. Eventually, however, they discovered, through a miscarriage in November 2005, that Maria could still become pregnant. On November 27, 2006, after 14 hours of labor, Sierra began to be born at Hemet Valley Medical Center in Hemet, California. Suddenly, it became clear that she was stuck in the birth canal, with only her head emerging. Manuel noticed the medical staff starting to act frantic and saw that his daughter's face was blue. Sierra's compressed umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck, and she lacked a heartbeat or respiration. When the delivery was complete, Sierra's APGAR score was 0. The APGAR score is used by doctors to assess a baby's life signs immediately after birth. Staff called out a code blue, and more medical personnel streamed into the delivery room. Even Annette Greenwood, Executive Director of Nursing, joined the group. Dr. Renato Giudalena, the OB-GYN, and Becky Gomez, an RN working in the labor and delivery unit, initially kept working with Maria, who did not yet know what was happening. Soon they joined the other physician and the rest of the medical team, who labored valiantly over Sierra for 21 minutes. Everyone did their best, but they observed no signs of life, cardiac or respiratory, during these 21 minutes. Believers among the staff prayed quietly as they worked, but Manuel, Maria, and their daughter Charissa were praying more vocally. 0, rang a nurse's voice a few times, reading the monitor. Finally, she queried the doctor, "Are you going to call it?" After sighing dejectedly, he pronounced Sierra dead at 2:59 p.m. The baby had been without oxygen for close to half an hour. The staff was distraught. Gomez, the main delivery nurse, was in tears. Most of the staff who had filled the small room began filing out, as equipment was removed from the still form of the hoped-for child. Sierra's father, however, suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of certainty. He could not give up. God had done so much for them already by bringing them to the point of birth, and he had spoken so clearly. They could not lose this child. Word had gone out for prayer, and Starla, their pastor's wife, was now praying in her home. Suddenly she felt led to cry out, "She will live and not die." Meanwhile, Maria overheard staff saying the child was declared dead. In the midst of her shock, however, she felt the Lord's comfort and envisioned Starla crying out precisely those words, "She will live and not die." She did not learn until later that Starla was in fact crying out those exact words. Manuel now prayed fervently over the body, the remaining staff patiently permitting him to express his faith and grief. Alluding to Lazarus, he cried, "God, so that everyone here will know you are alive and love your children, I say, Sierra, come forth." Other Christians present felt God's presence, and Manuel began praying in tongues, but the body remained lifeless. Perhaps sensing the discomfort of an ensuing silence, a nurse carried the baby's still form over to her mother's bed. It had been perhaps 5 minutes since the doctor had pronounced Sierra dead. "Come on, Mija, wake up," Maria pleaded, and suddenly noticed Sierra's chest moving. "I'm sorry, sweetie," the respiratory therapist tried to explain. "That's just the oxygen we pumped into her coming out now." But as Dr. Giudalena drew close to add his own voice of comfort, he also felt something. The child's heart had started beating. "Unbelievable!" he exclaimed. "Call code blue again!" Given how long Sierra had lacked a heartbeat, however, most of the medical staff were certain that if she survived at all, she would have severe brain damage. They initially debated whether to try to revive the child further. But when Annette Greenwood, director of nursing, saw the pink spreading across the baby's chest, she knew that the child was recovering. Greenwood recounts, "In all my 20 years of experience, I have never seen a baby come back from that length of time. I would say she was resurrected. It was God's divine intervention." Nurse Gomez concurs. "She was pronounced dead. She was dead. So definitely, she was resurrected." "I'm a Catholic," Dr. Giudalena adds. "She was resurrected. It was a miracle. It's beyond medical explanation." Not only did Sierra survive, but MRIs, EEGs, and so on all showed her to be normal. Finally, 11 days after her birth, the hospital sent her home with her parents. Nothing at all was wrong with her. As the story circulated, many churches invited Manuel and Maria to come share their testimony, and they brought their miracle baby with them. Their pastor, Peter Edwards of New Life Open Bible Church in San Jacinto, California, was with the family during their crisis. Today, he recounted a few years ago, she is a normal, active 10-year-old in our church. By the time I interviewed Sierra's father, Manuel, she was going on 14, and her father spoke proudly of her intelligence. Through interviews conducted by Peter Edwards, I also watched testimonies about the miracle from Dr. Judalena, Becky Gomez, and Annette Greenwood, all long-serving medical staff at Hemet Valley Medical Center. For additional accounts of unexpected resuscitations from death in religious contexts, see Part 5 of this book. Lone Survivor. When I interviewed Anthony Wainaina Njuguna, he and his wife, Edwina, were PhD students at Trinity International University near Chicago. They told me about the birth of their son, Adiel, in Kenya. About an hour after his birth, Adiel began to experience difficulty breathing. When the baby's breathing did not stabilize, the doctor grew concerned and advised Anthony and Edwina to seek out a larger medical facility. Because the hospital lacked a neonatal intensive care unit, and because Anthony and Edwina could not afford the more elite hospitals, they transferred the child to Kenyatta National Hospital. The neonatal nursing staff there were professional and caring, but most infants who ended up there were in severe condition. On the morning after his transfer to this hospital, Adiel stopped breathing for a full 10 minutes. A doctor was able to revive him, but warned that the brain damage from oxygen deprivation would be irreparable. Adiel would never be able to walk or talk. At best, he would stare blankly into space. Over the next 20 days, the couple witnessed the tragic death of 33 infants, all the infants in the unit except for Adiel. At first, the doctors shook their heads sadly at Wainaina, Anthony, who would read psalms and pray for his unconscious child. But as Adiel continued to live, they welcomed his father's continued prayers. But then doctors detected a serious heart problem that, if Adiel lived, would require open-heart surgery in 6 months. A couple of days later, they checked Adiel's brain. The doctor looked confused, rechecked his file, and then called over colleagues to examine both the scan and the chart. Then they called over the nurse and insisted that this was either the wrong baby or the wrong file. There was nothing wrong with Adiel's brain. Trying to figure out what had happened, staff prodded and poked Adiel so much that for days afterward he continued to recoil when touched. The discharge document admitted that the doctors did not know what had happened. At his 1-month review, a similar scene unfolded as doctors checked and rechecked his heart. His heart, too, was cured, and he was completely healthy. 9 years later, Anthony and Edwina introduced me to Adiel, who smiled as his father shared his story. We're calling this one a miracle. Born at just 25 weeks and 1 day and weighing 1.5 pounds, Gabrielle Nesh had a lengthy stay in the neonatal intensive care unit. Average birth weight tends to be about 7.5 pounds, 3.5 kilograms, with normal birth weight roughly 2 pounds in either direction. Gabrielle thus received significant medical attention. Nevertheless, one expected aspect of attention proved unnecessary. We have all the relevant medical records in his case, and they clearly show that at 9 months, Gabrielle had an inguinal hernia. This is a condition in which a loop of intestine can descend into the groin area and is at risk of becoming trapped there. The condition occasionally leads to dangerous complications, and, as Gabrielle's doctor rightly pointed out, it can be corrected only by surgery. The only known exceptions are extremely rare, and in these particular cases, the patients were prematurely born girls. Nevertheless, the family continued to pray that God would help their child without this operation. Some 45 minutes after the operation was scheduled to begin, the doctor reappeared and showed them pictures. You can see the scar tissue here where the hernia was before. But he must have healed himself. It's as if somebody had performed the surgery already. The Lord healed him, Gabrielle's father Elliot suggested. The doctor, who had earlier explained that an inguinal hernia cannot go away without surgery, conceded the point. Gabrielle's mother, Harmony, asked a nurse if this happened often. The nurse replied, "We're calling this one a miracle." Tumor treatment. Accounts abound of God enabling mothers to bear children after years of unsuccessful attempts. For example, of a pregnancy immediately following prayer after 15 years without giving birth. Another example is that of Sandra Rivera. In 1997, her doctors discovered a pituitary tumor that they believed would preclude pregnancy. Because of the tumor's location within the brain, the doctors ruled out surgery. Soon after this, Rivera committed her life to Christ and also received a prophecy that she would bear a child. Testing a year and a half after the initial diagnosis showed that the tumor was growing. Nevertheless, Rivera refused in faith to let go of what she believed God had said, and on Valentine's Day, 1997, her doctor appeared confused as he examined her new test results. The medical report attests that a small cavity remained where the tumor had been, but the tumor itself was gone. Since then, Rivera has had 2 children. A special needs adoption. In his younger days, Jeff Durbin, a world champion martial artist, portrayed Johnny Cage in Mortal Kombat Live Tour 1996 and Michelangelo and Donatello of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Today, after his conversion, Jeff is one of the pastors of Apologia Church in Arizona. Pastor Jeff and his wife Candy decided to adopt a baby whose prenatal testing identified special needs. I contacted Jeff after a mutual friend drew my attention to his public testimony. While in the womb, the boy they hoped to adopt was officially diagnosed with spina bifida. The birth mother had to see the doctor more than once a week for the rest of her pregnancy. Multiple ultrasounds made the condition clear. The baby was on the better side of the 4th and worst type of spina bifida. Once he was born, doctors would need to close the opening in his spine. They therefore expected that he would need to remain in the hospital for 2 to 6 weeks. Doctors warned that the Durbins would not be able to hold him directly after his birth because of the hole in his spine. They had also planned for a possible brain shunt, Jeff shared with me, due to complications they observed in the ultrasounds. Christians around the world were praying for this baby's wholeness, but the answer to their prayers exceeded their expectations. Baby Augustine was supposed to be in the newborn ICU, but when Jeff and Candy arrived at the hospital to meet him, they found someone holding him, which was not supposed to be allowed. Smiling, the nurse opened the bundle and turned Augustine over. His back was already whole. Jeff and Candy alternated between stunned silence and praising God. What were they to make of this? Like everyone else, they had seen the ultrasounds. "I don't know any explanation for this," a nurse volunteered. She noted that the team had been ready for the surgery once he was born, but when he arrived, they kept flipping him over, saying, "I can't explain this." They kept running tests, but Augustine had no open spine. Turning the child over again, a surgeon with more than 30 years of experience seemed mystified. "This is a normal baby," he observed to the birth mother. "Do you have another baby inside you?" A colleague asked, "Have you ever seen anything like this?" He shook his head. "This is my first time in over 30 years ever having seen anything like this." Visible growth. Kathleen and Michael Bratton were referred to a high-risk doctor because ultrasound showed abnormal growth in their preborn infant, Brielle. Brielle's arms were so short that doctors suspected achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism that can have potentially severe complications. Around 20 weeks, the doctor suggested abortion, but Kathleen and Michael maintained that all human life is valuable. They began fetal monitoring 3 times a week, the 3rd time with a full ultrasound, and kept praying for a miracle. At 36 weeks, a month early, the doctor decided to induce labor right away because of a dangerous reverse flow of the placenta. Contrary to expectations, Brielle was born healthy and able to breathe on her own. Her upper arms, however, remained short, as both pictures and medical reports attest. By the time Brielle was 6 months old, her pediatrician was demanding more testing. Because of potential complications, mere observation was no longer sufficient. Sunday morning during worship, Kathleen, who had seen others healed when she prayed for Brielle with fresh faith. "Arms, grow in the name of Jesus," she commanded. Suddenly, Kathleen saw the arm she was looking at get longer. The tip of her elbow was now peeking out of her jacket. So Kathleen urged, "Lord, do it again." And it grew a 2nd time, until Brielle's entire elbow was sticking out. When Kathleen took Brielle to the pediatrician several days later, the doctor declared, surprised, "Wow, her arms are longer. She doesn't need testing after all." Liver disease. Cameron and Caden Sturts of Clinton, Iowa, born several years apart, suffered from glycogen storage disease, IXA, a rare incurable genetic liver disease. Their cases also had distinctive features. Their mother, Corrine, reports that though Cameron and Caden received regular special feedings, their doctor was concerned. Their livers were becoming incapable of storing iron, and their arteries were hardening. Cameron's muscles grew so weak that sometimes he could not walk. His liver increased to 5 times the normal size, and his spleen doubled in size. His liver damage nearly approximated cirrhosis. His younger brother, Caden, whose heart enzymes became 3 times higher than normal, had even worse episodes. Caden was malnourished because he could not keep food down. He needed trips to the emergency room weekly. Their father, Darren, challenged their mother, Corrine, to be willing to accept however God healed them, in this life or by taking them home to heaven. Corrine resisted the latter idea angrily. But at a revival service in Rochelle, Illinois, she finally told God that she surrendered everything. She would praise Him whether He healed them or took them. Then she felt God say, "Now that you have released control to me, go get your boys, because I will heal them tonight." In the same service, Darren and Corrine's older child, Madison, began to pray for the afflicted, witnessing bones visibly shifting as she prayed. Madison laid hands on her younger brothers, and each of the boys felt that God had just healed them. 1 week later, medical tests on their blood confirmed that their blood values were normal, and their livers and spleens were now of normal size. Cameron's healing was instant and complete. Caden's began at the same time, but some features of his recovery were more progressive. In less serious forms of the disease, symptoms sometimes disappear gradually before adulthood, but one would not expect this to begin, and in one case become complete, for both brothers simultaneously. Nor in their case had survival to adulthood been guaranteed, especially in Caden's case. Pediatrician Dr. Neeru Agarwal, who had followed the boys from birth, testifies on a video now online, "It's a miracle." Jesus heals a flow of blood. In Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34, Jesus heals a woman with a long-term flow of blood. When I was visiting a seminary in India, seminarian Siyam Jivan Babu shared with me his mother's experience. Each of her 3 babies died, and then she suffered a flow of blood for many years. Despite petitions to other gods, she was not healed. Finally, she prayed to Jesus, and he healed her and promised her a son for ministry. Siam is that son. These are merely samples of some reports about the healing of infants or young children. Some reports appear to be even more dramatic than these, such as reporting healing from AIDS or raisings within the womb. If some listeners do not consider these reports concrete enough to allow for the possibility of cases of special divine action, perhaps some accounts in Part 3 of this book will invite further consideration. Part 3. Videos and Doctors' Reports. Physicians are particularly well qualified to certify cures today. Whether cures are divinely caused is a theological question, but whether they are genuine is a medical one. Admittedly, some physicians are more prepared to certify cures than others, and some are more willing to call them miracles than are others. Records can, however, show whether a person who once had a condition has it no longer. Subsequent parts of the book will also note some doctors' reports, but I cite more here than in earlier chapters. I have tried to compromise between grouping events by kind, such as healings of infants or brain recoveries, and a section focused on video and medical reports. Naturally, there is some overlap, and I could have placed some accounts elsewhere. Before proceeding, I should respond to one objection some critics raise against even some medical documentation. Some skeptics want to dismiss medical reports by doctors who believe in miracles, calling them biased. Such an approach, however, itself stacks the deck in a biased way. It accepts evidence of miracles only from those who disbelieve in miracles, who will naturally be reluctant to define a recovery as a miracle. We do not ordinarily follow this kind of logic. Nations that allow freedom of conscience, for example, do not ordinarily require witnesses to deny their belief systems before providing legal evidence, whether those belief systems are theistic, atheistic, or something else. In most cases of medical documentation, we actually lack knowledge of the physician's personal beliefs, though in some settings, such as the Catholic shrine at Lourdes, investigators deliberately seek some verdicts from experts of other faiths or no faith. The issue in medical documentation is not a physician's theological opinion, but the medical certification of before and after conditions. In this section, we consider what some deem harder evidence, videos and medical reports. So, what would the doctor say?